When I first saw it, I thought I was trying to sell a dead woman's clothes. Of course, it was legit. Her closet was full of clothes. She died in a nursing home with no next of kin, which meant no one was paying her bills. Instead of leaving her abandoned closet for free, standard practice in the self-care industry was to wait until the balance was 36 days past due before sending it to auction. When it came time to put the apartment up for auction, there was a simple checklist to follow. Cut the lock. Open the unit. Take a picture of the contents. Record what you see. Lock up the apartment. Seal it with an auction tag. Upload everything to the internet. I had just been transferred to a new company, but I'd been working in the warehouse for several years. As an assistant manager, I was already used to hustling and filling in for others when help was needed. I had resigned myself to the idea that if I did everything I was told, it would lead to a raise or promotion. It barely led to the former and never seemed to lead to the latter. The business manager, Jack, was a serious middle-aged man who always looked tired and disliked small talk. Long periods of silence were hard on me, but I tried my best to stay busy serving customers or cleaning the place. The day we had to cut the locks, Jack seemed like the most talkative person I'd ever seen. He insisted that we adhere to every item on the list as if it were scripture. The grinder saw needed to be fully charged and a new saw blade installed. All paperwork and safety equipment had to be with us before we could leave the office and begin the task at hand. Admittedly, I was a little annoyed that Jack had finally decided to talk, but only to give me an order and lecture me on a process I'd been through 50 times before. I remember the last thing he demanded before we closed the office. Be sure to do everything I tell you to do when we pick this lock. It was such an inappropriate statement. I understood there was a legal process we had to follow, but Jack took it too seriously, considering how much they were paying us. 2 employees were required to prepare the property for auction. The company tells you that this is for legal purposes, as you are not allowed to touch the property or enter it at all. Having 2 people helps increase liability. At least that's what they claimed. That was a lie. Normally, you assign preparatory tasks as you see fit. Jack's task was to cut the lock, while I documented what I saw inside the room. Mrs. Mary, our late tenant, had only moved in 6 months ago. I remembered showing her the apartment and how she explained to me that she only had clothes she couldn't get rid of. This was not uncommon. People usually kept things they never used and paid several times their value for the pleasure. I had already written clothes when Jack cut the lock. Orange sparks lit up the long, unremarkable hall of identical closets as the saw cut the steel lock. I still remember the metallic sound of the ripped lock hitting the concrete floor. Jack opened the metal roll-up door, and there it was. It was at least 7 feet high, and I almost mistook it for a work of art at first. It was made of thin strips of the same metal from which the door Jack had opened had been made. The strips were stacked in several layers and twisted into long coils that formed rough semblances of a torso and limbs, creating an imitation of a humanoid form. The metal sheets had small slits where the metal was bent and twisted, and each was stuffed with tattered clothing, children's toys, and what could only be described as bits of innards. His head was nothing more than a slightly thicker metal spiral, but what I saw was what I dreamed of. It was doll hair, scattered into several strands. There was a small eye staring at us from a nearby crevice, but I couldn't tell if it belonged to a doll's head or something scarier. "Don't move," Jack shouted. I obeyed. My confusion was quickly replaced by horror when I realized that what we were looking at was alive. I saw it sway slightly and heard a slight metallic clang as its intertwined parts collided loosely with each other. "What is it?" I asked, my instincts telling me not to obey Jack's order. I wanted to run. I wanted to run away. "Don't move," Jack repeated, but the creature didn't seem to respond to any of our voices. Jack spoke with an authority that told me I had to obey him. It seemed like I stood like that for ages, though it was hardly more than a few moments before what happened next happened. The creature began to shake. At first, it was nothing more than a concussion, a metallic sound, like clanking metal strips, grew stronger and stronger. Soon the whole being shook with such force that I thought it might completely collapse. The narrow corridors of concrete and metal reflected this terrible sound with a resounding echo. At that moment, Jack jumped up, grabbed the door handle, and threw it to the floor, separating us from the creature with only a thin layer of metal sheeting. The sound stopped almost immediately. When Jack finally convinced me that the threat was over, I had a lot more questions than he had answers. The previous owner of the facility had been working with him when Jack first saw him, which was over 6 years ago. After the sale of the facility to my company, the outgoing owner felt it was necessary to train the new facility manager. The word prepare may have been an exaggeration, as Jack knew the rules but didn't understand why it was necessary. He eventually shared them with me, confident that I would never have believed him if he had tried to warn me in advance. Rules. Rules. There are always 2 people involved when preparing items for auction. No exceptions. After the lock is cut, open the door all the way. Do not attempt to look inside with the door partially open. If the unit is inside, do not move it. This includes turning its head or looking away. Wait until the creature begins to shake violently. Until then, do not attempt to move. Move only to close the door immediately. You may return in 1 hour to finish documenting the contents of the object. My initial reaction was to just leave and never come back, even though Jack insisted that we would be perfectly safe if we followed the rules. They'd worked for him without fail for the past 6 years. I would have laughed in his face if I hadn't been so scared. I told him, in swear words, that there was no way I was going to get paid enough to go near that thing one more time. I was halfway out the door when he told me that the corporation knew about the creature, and if I stayed, they would double my salary. It seemed like my life should have cost more. But anyone who lives from paycheck to paycheck can tell you it's not always that simple. That was 3 years ago. The next 2 years went about the same as they had before. I learned the truth. I dreaded the day of lockpicking, but over time, my new paycheck eased that fear somewhat. The creature appeared as often as it didn't, and as Jack said, following the rules always resulted in us getting through the whole process safely. Eventually, the repetitive nature of our work caused me to treat the creature as I would any other dangerous power tool. I was afraid of it, but no longer worried about my safety beyond my control. Last year, I learned that Jack was getting a divorce. I hadn't even realized he was married, but in a rare moment of candor, he admitted that he'd stopped wearing the ring long before the divorce was finalized. I wasn't even sure how to react to these revelations. We'd had so little contact with each other during our time together that he might have seemed like a stranger, without much enthusiasm. I advised him to let me know if he needed anything. He only nodded, and so we returned to the familiar silence that defined our working relationship. Thinking back on it, I remember how tired he looked afterward. His sunken eyes dimmed and yellowed as he performed his daily movements, almost on autopilot. He was almost 15 years older than me, so any advice I could have given seemed inappropriate and out of place, considering we were acquaintances at best. Jack's divorce had been going on for 10 months now, and it seemed to me that only now was the turning point. Lock-picking day had arrived, and we were preparing for the task as we had so many times before. There were 3 squads of us when it happened. Jack cut the lock, put the grinder aside, and almost eagerly opened it. It stood silent, only a metallic creak echoing from its uneven rocking. We stood motionless, which at that moment became second nature to us. Jack turned his head in my direction. I didn't dare move, but my extreme surprise must have been evident on my face. "I'm sorry." That was all he said before heading straight for the creature. He took 2 steps forward before long metal tentacles erupted from the creature, and the screech of grinding metal drowned out my screams. The stream of aluminum tentacles enveloped Jack in a ferocious cocoon and pulled him inside the device. I jumped forward and reached for the door handle as the tentacles turned their attention to me. I slammed the door shut, but several metal strips flew out of it. They lunged at me, sharp slashes cleaving the air in a desperate search. One strip caught up with me as I was locking the block and slammed into my arm with a jagged edge of torn metal. I cried out in pain, jumped back, and fell out of reach. I held my bloody hand, expecting the tsunami of metal limbs to slip out from under the door and consign me to the same fate as Jack. Nothing came of it, however. I don't know what drove Jack to this end. I try to focus on not being upset that he almost took me with him. Naturally, shortly after that incident, I was offered the position of site manager and another promotion. I now had my own assistant, and we had the same tacit understanding of what was in store for us in these units. I never found any trace of Jack, even when it was time to return to the same unit and finalize the auction process. I don't know what caused this creature to appear. Perhaps something happens when you fill a building with memories. You don't just keep toys, clothes, or furniture, but the emotions that connect these items to their owners. Whether it's nostalgia for better times, loss of what once was, or simply a fear of moving forward, these emotions accumulate from floor to ceiling, marinating in a dangerous attachment to the past. Perhaps the result is some horrible thing built of metal and fear. I don't know. I'm just the facility manager. But I know he's waiting, and I know it will never let go.